going to talk about the Fire Adapted Communities Framework, or FAC framework, and share some examples of how communities across the U.S. are working to improve their fire resilience. And we're also going to answer some frequently asked questions, including the questions of those of you who are on the webinar.
So what do we actually mean when we say fire adapted communities? That's a question we get a lot. And one of the things that we want to convey today is really that fire adapted communities is a framework for community wildfire resilience. It is a way of thinking about how we live better with wildland fire. A fire adapted community is a community that understands its risk, takes action before, during, and after fire to be more resilient. The things essentially that you do to lessen the impact of wildfire make you more fire adapted. So at its most basic level, fire adapted communities is a concept that came out of the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy to help communities really think about the actions that they could take to better live with wildfire. FAC isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not a checklist or even a specific set of actions that communities have to take. And this is probably one of the core concepts that we'd really like to convey today, is that FAC is a framework. And the reason it's a framework is that our communities that are all different, they have different sizes, they have different economies, they have different policies, they can all take the ideas and concepts from that framework and adapt them to meet their local needs. FAC isn't an endpoint. This isn't someplace you end up when you've done all of the magical right things. The things that each community does to make them more adapted to wildfire are going to differ community to community. And those communities are always changing. The political environment changes, the ecosystem changes, even the people that live in our communities change. This change is really one of our constants. And that means that our work to create these fire adapted communities isn't complete. It's something that we're going to need to steward over time, that we're going to need to nurture and adapt our programs and priorities through time as our communities change. And so this is one of the reasons that a framework is effective for this, because your local context matters. You all know your communities best. So fire adapted communities isn't about someone from the outside telling you what to do. It's not about us saying, okay, you've met this threshold or the bar, but it's about really helping you think about who and how to engage folks in your community, what partners are at your table, the suite of potential actions and programs that you can tackle in your place. And so to break this framework down, this presentation is going to talk a little bit about who should be involved in a fire adapted community, what fire adapted communities look like, what actions they might take, and when fire adaptation happens over time. We're going to begin with the who of fire adaptation. So similar to FEMA and their whole community approach, fire adapted communities have a role for everyone in the community. If you've been around fire adapted communities concepts before, you may have heard the phrase, everyone has a role. And that's something that we really want to emphasize. So as we talk through this, take a minute to think about where you fit in your own community. And remember that anyone can be working on fire adaptation. You don't have to be an agency representative. You don't have to be a community leader or even a member of the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. Fire adaptation isn't about being official. Adapting our communities to wildfire is about taking action. So traditional community wildfire practitioners can't do all the work on our own. And it's just really important that the whole community is considered when we talk about moving this fire adaptation forward. We have to ask ourselves who's at the table and who we could be working with on our FAC efforts. So if you're a practitioner and you're concerned with smoke outreach, for example, and this is definitely something that is at the forefront of folks' minds right now, you might want to partner with your public health officials, a local tourism group, your chamber of commerce, or local politicians. And you can see in this graphic who is involved in community wildfire adaptation, that some of those folks have been identified. Community members, local wildfire practitioners going around sort of the left-hand side here, state and local tribal government representatives, public health, researchers, federal agencies, business and tourism, land managers, and I'm sure there are rules that we haven't identified that exist in a fire-adapted community. The important thing to note is that it's helpful to have the support and input from all of these partners who may also be able to help you share the load. Similarly, those partners have expertise in areas that you might not have, and they can bring up important considerations that maybe that haven't occurred to you yet, or that are different from your own. Some people and organizations may fit into more than one group. I, for example, I'm a community member. I'm a resident of my place, but I'm also a local wildfire practitioner. I work for a nonprofit. I volunteer with my local fire department. You know, there are residents who are also our business leaders, our Chamber of Commerce presidents, and our land managers. They may work for our state and federal forestry agencies, but they're also residents. They may have affiliations beyond just the one hat that we see them wearing most commonly. And some people may work outside of their traditional roles. You may have a number of people wearing a number of different hats. And some people, they prefer to stay in their lane. But what we don't want to do is to silo people or limit them to say this is the only way in which you fit this community and the only avenue in which you can participate. Because we have a pretty heavy load to adapt our communities to wildland fire. We can't do all of that work alone. And just because there are a number of different avenues for people to participate, it doesn't mean that we together or as any individual need to do all of the things. And that's really why we need to have partners working together with us. I think it's helpful to look at an example as we talk about partnerships and practitioners and fire adaptation. So we're going to turn to a community in Ashland, Oregon, where we can talk a little bit about who's involved in their adaptation efforts. Ashland is located in Southern Oregon, and you may know them for their fantastic Shakespeare Festival. In wildfire circles, however, it's probably more likely that you know them for their partnerships. They have been working on wildfire preparedness and forest resilience for decades. But their more recent work on smoke preparedness is a great way to highlight a diversity of partnerships, and so that's what we're going to focus on. Smokewise Ashland formed in 2016 to help the community better prepare for wildfire smoke. So when we looked at that previous slide and we talked about who could be involved in fire adaptation, public health practitioners, wildfire practitioners, you'll see many of those folks represented in this effort. The photo that you see on the slide on the right was taken from the Smokewise website, and you'll see the logos at the bottom from Asante, the community health provider in Ashland, Oregon, the Chamber of Commerce, City of Ashland, Ashland Fire and Rescue, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. It's a really diverse, collaborative group working to prepare the community of Ashland for smoke. And when we think about fire adapted communities, we often find ourselves thinking about the traditional partnerships, right? The local fire departments working with the land management agencies and residents. But if we limit our partnerships to just those traditional cooperators, we're really limiting our adaptation work itself. To tackle smoke and smoke readiness in Ashland, Oregon, there needed to be a suite of partners, many of them not necessarily traditional ones. So Ashland's an important example because it shows how effective partnerships can be when they extend outside of our traditional reach. And we could highlight a number of different efforts throughout the country as well. Another effort close to my area is the Okanogan County Long-Term Recovery Effort, and it's hosted a series of wildfire preparedness events over the last spring, which brought together wildfire specialists, land managers, school students, local business owners, and others, all to better prepare for wildland fire. But in that case, the convener, the Okanagan County Long-Term Recovery Effort, is a nonprofit, and they formed in response to the 2014 wildfires in their place. So it's just really important to remember when we think about the who of fire adaptation, not only do our partners come from a wide array of roles in their community, but our conveners and our leaders do as well. So take a minute and think about your place, who you are and who you're working with right now. Is there a sector missing? Is there someone that you'd like to be working with on community wildfire resilience in your place that you're not currently working with? So in the chat box, we're going to ask you that same question. Who would you like to be working with on community wildfire resilience in your place? Go ahead and take a minute to answer.
Thanks for answering that question. So as Annie just described, there is really no limit to the folks who can play roles in really helping to increase your wildfire resilience and work on reducing your wildfire risk. So now we want to talk a little bit about what fire adaptation really looks like. And so on your screen, you'll see that there's a graphic. This graphic was designed by fire adaptation leaders in communities to help describe and kind of create a framework to help bucket and categorize some of the work that they've been doing in their communities that have really helped them on their journey to improve resilience. So it describes this set of components that is in the inner circle and then gives examples in the outer circle of how those kinds of different topic areas actually show up on the ground. Just to reiterate, we want you to remember that fire adapted communities is not a one-size-all or prescriptive approach. Every single community's journey to living better with fire is unique. And this is also not meant to be a checklist. So the purpose of this graphic is not to hand it out to all of your partners and say, well, who's going to work on the fuel breaks and who's going to work on prescribed fire and who's going to work on thinning, and kind of kick down the list, thinking that each of the activities described here has to be implemented in your place. The most important thing you can do with your partners in your community is to think about what challenges you're facing and what assets you have, and then create a plan to help yourselves move forward on the things that are most salient and most resonant with your community at that time. And then to revisit and consider again, as your community members change, as the context you're living in changes, what do we need to continue to work on? We do want to also say that this graphic is not designed to be completely comprehensive. We know there are things that folks are doing that are not depicted on this graphic, and that doesn't mean those are not valuable. We tried to just create something that people could digest and to help them kind of have a jumping off place. There's also not a particular order that people need to go in order to start working on fire adaptation. Everyone has their own entry point, the reason they got involved, and those are all different, and there really isn't an ideal order to this work. So to parse this graphic out a little bit more and just help you be able to use this both for your own thinking and with your partners, I want to dive in a little bit to just this inner circle that's on your screen now, that the teal kind of components of the work. So this shows what those are, and these again are not necessarily comprehensive, but these are some of the kind of main themes that we see popping up in many different communities. They're kind of broad categories or topical areas, and some of them again might be more important to your community than others. What's important to work on will change. If you've just had a recent wildfire, the wildfire recovery bucket may become a way more important piece of your work than it had been in the past. And you know, if you're coming up for plans and regulations that are relevant, reviews of those things, smoke management plans, or maybe it's a general plan update in your area, then engaging in a cyclical way with those plans and regulations may be more important at different times. So we'd like you to think now for a second about all of these topic areas on your screen and think about which of those topical areas is the main focus of your individual work in your community. You can pick one or two, and please put that in the chat box. And after you've thought about what is the sort of main focus of your work is right now, we'd like you to also be thinking about an area where you might be interested in expanding your work. And after you've put in your main focus, we'd like you to enter also the area that you'd be most interested in expanding your work to include. So now I want to focus a little bit on that outer circle. So this green outer circle shows examples of the programs and specific actions that communities could take. Again, this is not a comprehensive list, but the purpose here is to just provide some examples of the kinds of programs and activities that communities might pursue related to any of these specific sort of topics that were in that inner circle that you were reacting to. And now I want to give a couple of examples. So in your community, you might want to work on safety and evacuation as part of your effort. But how you choose to do that could be through various different efforts. So perhaps you have a Ready, Set, Go program. And Ready, Set, Go addresses both pre-fire preparedness work as well as evacuation. So also note that the kinds of segmenting that we did here is not necessarily to force any one of these programs into a silo. Some of these things are cross-cutting programs. So you might want to start a Ready, Set, Go program, or maybe you already have a Ready, Set, Go program in your community, but there's also other things you can do to work on safety and evacuation, including having conversations about safety zones in your community, working on ingress and egress routes, developing preparedness, such as go kits and evacuation plans, or maybe you're even working on partnerships. Maybe you're working with your local sheriff's department or your local office of emergency management to develop new partnerships to help with safety and evacuation conversations and planning. Again, it could be any of these things, or it could be a variety of other tactics that relate to safety and evacuation. Let's take another example of communities that are thinking about engaging in their resident or community mitigation. This is one of the most common sort of entry points that we've heard about in terms of folks coming to this work and saying, well, I really got involved because I either am a resident or I wanted to work with residents on community mitigation. And so in some places, the FireWise USA program is sort of the centerpiece of that effort. There are many amazing FireWise USA sites that have achieved a lot of great work and are helping to support residents and neighborhoods in their efforts and help them collaborate with each other and get good work done on the ground. In other places, your community might have an assessment certification. There's a program called Wildfire Partners in Boulder, Colorado, where they work with homeowners to create defensible space and home hardening plans. And some communities might have a cost share chipping program or a home retrofit program in their place that community members can apply to become part of. Other folks are working with developers and builders to design neighborhoods that are more resilient to fire before they're even constructed. And so it's really important to have a variety of excellent programs and options to support this kind of work. And the particular way that we approach this might be very, very different. So in my own hometown of Hayfork, it's a town of 2,500 people in the middle of a national forest. How we approach resident mitigation is different than, say, work in a neighborhood in Austin, Texas, or a community in Hawaii, or in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. And we know that tailoring our approaches to build on the assets and culture of those particular places are really the best ways to get traction. So now I want to give you a couple of additional examples of communities that maybe had a single entry point to this work and then have grown that over time. So on your screen, you can see a map of the US, and there's some pretty big stars on there. So one of those stars is meant to represent Ely, Minnesota, and the other is meant to represent the folks in the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. And both of those communities really started out with individual points. So I'm going to start in Ely, where they were working on community engagement work. They had some Firewise USA sites, and they had some community wildfire protection planning that was going on, but they really recognized that by coordinating those efforts and getting all of the partners together, the fire department, the local government, the folks who were working with their Firewise USA sites, that they might be able to develop a broader vision for what living better with fire could really mean in their community. And so while they didn't necessarily have a hugely robust program, they were able to bring together the efforts of several different partners and create a lot more impact than each of those individual efforts was having on their own. So we first got engaged with folks in Ely back in 2013, and it's been really incredible to see how much they've been able to achieve by bringing those partnerships together, figuring out how to leverage one another's efforts, and seeing what else they could add to their portfolio that would really help take the next steps. So some of the things that folks there have been doing lately, this spring they hosted a series of webinars about business resilience and have been really thinking about wildfire recovery as this leading edge of the work that they want to start adding to their portfolio. New Jersey is another great example. In the Pine Barrens, the folks we've worked with there really recognized that they had a really serious risk problem on their hands. They had a vulnerable demographic, a lot of elderly residents, and a lot of risk. And they had an established Ready, Set, Go program with some of their local fire companies, and they really wanted to think about how to build on that work. And so when we first engaged with them, they spent a lot of time learning about what other communities across the country were doing, how they were framing their priorities. And since our engagement with them in 2014, they've been able to start engaging a lot more heavily in prescribed fire. They've worked actually on a statewide scale to increase the use of prescribed fire and develop really cool partnerships, and even work on legislation to help enable more prescribed fire across the entire state. And so from a Ready, Set, Go program and the realization that they had a really big issue on their hands, they've been able to, with just a little bit of small investment and inspiration from other communities, been able to really see the opportunity to expand and build on their programming to have, again, a bigger impact. So we want to transition now and talk a little bit. We've talked about who is involved in fire adapted communities, and we've talked a little bit about what the Fire Adapted Communities framework is, and the many, many actions that any community might take at any time to be engaged in that work. But we want to emphasize that when fire adaptation happens is also really important. And so the graphic on your screen is something that was created by the folks at the Washington State Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. It's a really helpful depiction of the reality that for communities, they have to deal with the impacts of a fire before, during, and after a fire. Because they live in that place and they are the ones who have to deal with those impacts, their resilience and ability to engage before, during, and after a fire is really kind of at the heart of fire adapted communities. A lot of times people think that FAC work is just about preparedness and mitigation work, that it's about being as ready as we can for a fire, and that's certainly important. But there are also ways that communities can engage along the full cycle, and it's also important to note that living with fire is not really a linear experience. You know, communities, many communities have already experienced fires, and they may be simultaneously in a recovery process and a preparation process for another fire. So we want to make sure that we're really thinking not just about preparedness and mitigation work before a fire and telling people that that's their only realm, but also recognizing and supporting efforts that handle post-fire recovery and business resilience, that are engaging in conversation about enabling conditions for managed fire and engagement with incident management teams if you do have a fire in your community, and really thinking holistically about what can be done before, during, and after a fire. So again, I want to give you a couple of examples of communities that are really working across this sort of cycle, this temporal cycle. The folks in the Mid-Klamath in Northern California, you can see a picture of one of their communities along the river there on the left-hand side of your screen. They have a really incredible community and culture around fire. That area is the Aboriginal territory of the Karuk tribe, and they have an amazing cultural burning and relationship with fire that I think has really supported a lot of their values around engagement with fire. And so they've definitely not been kept to this kind of narrower idea of community preparation, but have thought a lot about how fire use and how engaging with fire teams that might come to work on big campaign fires in the national forest and public lands around their communities, how those things really matter to their place and to the outcomes that they're trying to achieve. And so they've taken some really cool steps to share a lot about cultural burning with other practitioners across the country. And they've also developed some really cool programs, and we're going to share these links to some blogs they've written about this, to a program called the Community Liaison Program, which is designed to help make the role of community members in an incident management team more robust and more engaged. Folks that live in this community, fire really shapes a lot of their lives, and they recognized that they had a lot of really important local knowledge to share. When a fire team came to town, you know, they were planning and implementing prescribed burns on these lands, and they know this country, and they wanted to make sure that fire teams that were coming to town had the benefit of that knowledge, and also had the recognition that they really have developed a strong community vision about the role they want fire to play on the landscape. And so they wanted to communicate that to those teams so that they could manage the fire in a way that is respectful of that vision and hopefully could help forward that vision if that was possible. And so they've really created some innovative approaches to ways communities can have access in that during the fire time. And then the second example I want to give is the folks in Southwest Colorado here on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. This is a chipping project they just finished. The folks with the Wildfire Adapted Partnership that work in a several county area in Southwest Colorado have done really incredible work around organizing community volunteers and neighborhood efforts to do preparedness work, but then they've also had fires in those areas that they've needed to recover from. And they've engaged with residents to really try to understand what the impacts on their landscapes and private properties were going to be from fires, and then engage with local watershed managers and utilities and other folks in envisioning what fire recovery really could look like for those landowners, and helping them make that transition from doing the good work preparing to also having support and connections for after the fire came to town. How do we really help make sure that we get better outcomes for those same landowners who did, not only the ones who did preparedness work, but the ones who are now feeling the impacts of those fires. And again, we'll share some links following this presentation to stories that describe the work that both of these groups have done in the during and post-fire realms.
So now that we've gone over what fire adapted communities are, this concept that fire adapted communities is a framework, that it's accessible, that anyone taking action to better live with wildland fire is a fire adapted community. We've gone over a little bit about who works in fire adaptation and the importance of diverse partnerships and strong relationships and involvement of your whole community. And then Michelle just walked us through some great examples of fire adapted communities work in action, what the practices that help these communities better live with wildland fire, what that really looks like. I think it's important to just take one more second to say, what are we not? And that is finite. Fire adapted communities is not a program or a checklist that ends. It's a process that communities undergo continually to better prepare themselves to live with wildland fire, its effects before fire occurs, and to deal with its effects after fire has come through the landscape. We're not a designation program. There's no way to get a certificate to say that you've met a predefined set of recognitions, standards, and we're not a curriculum. Fire adapted communities does not have a one-stop shop for adaptation. We really recognize that every community has local values. They have a pathway toward adaptation that is uniquely their own, and that we need to support these local places as they undergo this process to better living with wildland fire. Now, we asked all of you when you registered for this webinar to identify some questions and to say, what questions do you have about fire adapted communities? And you had lots of them. So we're going to take a few minutes to go through some of those questions and provide answers. And if you still have questions, please do take a moment to put your questions in the chat box. But we'll go ahead and start answering the ones that you posed ahead of registration today.
Thanks so much. Yeah, you guys had great questions. Hopefully we've done a little bit to already answer this one, but I'm just, for the sake of reiterating it, and this all, because this comes up a lot, is there were several questions sort of about how the FACT framework fits with the FireWise USA program. And so hopefully folks recognize that the FACT framework is not a replacement of the FireWise program. We've often heard that question. The FACT framework has benefited tremendously from the amazing groundwork that the FireWise USA program has laid. And many of the FireWise USA leaders and practitioners, once they have done the FireWise work in their communities, see that they may have opportunities to do work in some of those other topical areas that were on that FACT graphic. And so the FACT framework just provides them with some next steps that they can take in their place to continue building on that resident mitigation and engagement work that they were able to complete through the FireWise USA program. So again, FireWise USA is an amazing resource for communities and is really an entry point for so many people into this broader set of work. And the Fire Adapted Communities framework just helps people see additional steps and activities that they could take to continue further building their resilience. So we also had some questions about collaborative planning processes, and I think Annie's gonna field those.
So we had several. One was how to develop project prioritization processes with stakeholder input and buy-in. And that's a great question. I think there's a number of resources available for the development of community wildfire protection plans. And community wildfire protection plans are really an opportunity for diverse stakeholders to come together, assess their risk, and determine some steps forward. There's a number of best practices documents out there, so I'm not going to go through those, but I think it's really important to note that through that planning process, whether it be a community wildfire protection plan or your local natural hazard mitigation plan, usually that's developed in conjunction with your emergency management department. It's a FEMA document. That there are some processes out there that really ask us to identify risk and prioritize some actions. It's important to note that the diversity of your participation in that process, the more robust your community collaborative effort is, the better those plans will represent the needs and values of the whole community. The other question we got was about ideas for developing prioritization framework using objective criteria at multiple spatial scales. So folks are basically asking if there are ways to take objective data and develop a process to prioritize presumably areas for treatment or action based on that objective data. And there are several examples of this throughout the country. The U.S. Forest Service is currently working on one such effort. It is the through the Shared Stewardship program, and really looking at an outcome-based investment strategy and scenario-based investment planning. And that scenario investment planning platform is under development and gives us a, hopefully will give us a good step forward. Region 6, the United States Forest Service, has also utilized a spatial analysis completed by Pyrologics and it's called the Quantitative Wildfire Risk Assessment. And they used GIS data to evaluate the probability of fire occurrence and its potential impacts on what they termed highly valued resources and assets. And they did use a collaborative process, invited stakeholder input to talk about the assets that and resources that should be valued and to what degree. We've also seen on some state scales, Washington State has another great example, the 20-year forest health strategic plan for Eastern Washington used a collaborative process at the watershed scale, so bringing it down just one more level to really identify places that were in need of treatments. The one caution that I would just add here is that anytime you have a process like this, your outputs are only as good as your inputs. And in the risk assessment that Pyrologics did with the Forest Service, for example, it undervalued rangeland assets and rangeland values, not because they didn't recognize that those things were important, but because it was challenging to have a data layer that was sufficient when it came to rangeland assets, that showed the miles of fencing, that showed where our grazing lands were for that region, that entire Region 6 area. So it's just really important, I think, for us to remember that these prioritization frameworks are excellent and a great starting point, but I think we really ultimately need to be convening as wide of an array of stakeholders as we can and asking them about their local conditions. And sometimes we have to do that interactive and subjective consensus building work to get to robust prioritization at the local level. One of the other questions that we received, and I think Michelle's going to tackle this, we had a lot of questions about equity, and I think it's really important that we take a minute to address those.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much, Annie. Equity came up several times in your questions, and we're really happy that it did, because it's been something that's been on our minds and in conversations that we've been having with FACNet folks and with other partners for the last few years. And I think we definitely are excited to be diving further into this and placing even more importance on taking action on this work. So one thing that we have discovered is that a lot of folks are really seeking some support in having trainings and really understanding how to engage with equity. And so something that we've been working on through the network is to offer some trainings and sort of leadership development around equity and around understanding basic frameworks and concepts around diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. It's really, really important that folks who are in leadership positions within their communities or that are coordinating efforts really get aware about these issues and recognize their own ability to engage their whole community. We're never going to achieve the goals that we have and reach that kind of North Star that we're constantly working towards of a more resilient community if we don't engage the entire community. You know, getting certain neighborhoods more resilient, you know, that might be progress, but I think it's really critical that we examine if who we're helping, and if we're just reinforcing the resilience of people who may already be fairly resilient, and ignoring folks who might be very vulnerable to the impacts of a wildfire. The other thing that I think is really important for us to do, in addition to thinking about our own influence and ability to prioritize our actions and to recognize the needs of our whole community and engage in authentic conversation with our entire community, is to look at the programs and approaches that we're using and really examine them for barriers to entry, for inherent bias and unconscious bias that might be kind of built in to the way that those programs are either designed and or deployed. And so I would just encourage folks to really take the time and effort to think about the methods and tools that you're using, and to get feedback from the folks that you're really wanting to work with about the right ways to engage with them, ways that honor and respect their values and interests, and that are not there to kind of save other people, but instead there to really come and work together to really help move forward as a whole community. So, you know, as an example, there's several folks in FACnet who have identified working on these issues as a real important initiative that they're trying to take on. So some of the examples of that, again, in Ashland, the example that Annie was sharing earlier, they've been working for the last couple of years in a partnership with their unhoused residents and some of the folks who provide services to those folks. And they're really taking a thoughtful approach at engaging in a dialogue and understanding what the needs and interests of those unhoused residents are in terms of fire preparedness and fire safety issues, and, you know, talking about things like evacuation notifications. And so there's amazing examples of that work going on there. I guess I will just also say, offer one of the specific questions that was asked about equity from you all, and I'm going to suggest that folks who know anything about this enter their answers in the chat box. So one of those questions was, how are FACT practitioners working with disadvantaged communities through education and outreach or grant opportunities? So most of you who've joined us are FACT practitioners, and so please, if you know about any initiatives or if you're working on this yourselves, please go ahead and answer that person's question in the chat box. Again, it is, how are FACT practitioners working with disadvantaged communities through outreach or education or grant opportunities? And while folks are doing that, we have a couple more questions, and then we are going to wrap up here with just a couple of additional slides. So one of the other questions we had was, how do we effectively leverage the limited resources we might have in a rural area? And I'm going to invite my colleagues to also tag on to my answer here. But I will just say, as a person who grew up and lives in a rural area myself, I think one of the really important things to recognize is that while there may be limited resources, and certainly there are, I think there are also some major assets that rural areas often have. In my experience, the relationships and the closeness and the understanding of a community in a rural area can be such a huge benefit in working on this resilience work. In fact, again, I mentioned a book that the network was reading earlier, and one of the comments from that book and the science is actually that the most valuable thing that a community can have when it needs to bounce back from a natural disaster like a fire is its relationships and community connections. That plays the closeness of those connections and their ability to leverage those connections becomes the most important factor in their recovery, more important than their infrastructure or any other factor. And so I think rural areas really have an advantage in that way, in that your school board president may also be your Rotary Club member president and your cashier at the grocery store. And so, and you know, all of those connections and that shared effort, as well as, you know, the fact that people know each other, really can help folks when it comes to working together and certainly in recovering from a fire. Do any of my colleagues want to add anything on to that answer?
That was great, Michelle. Thanks.
Well, Emily, I'm going to pass on the last question to you then, and then we can share our last resources slide. So our last question was about community engagement and what lessons we've learned about what works and doesn't work, especially during COVID.
Thanks, Michelle. So I'm going to kind of speed through this question because we've actually got some really great examples that we're going to share after this webinar is over. We're going to send a follow-up email to participants that includes some links to some lessons around this very topic that have come out of our FACnet members who have been particularly innovative and creative with how they're continuing to move their work forward during this time of COVID. And we've seen some really cool things from drive-up events to various virtual planning processes to other kind of community relationship building through Zoom, Firewise, workshops and engagement opportunities online. So we've got a couple great blog posts and even a resource that FACnet created on great online workshops and some of our tips that we have. So I've got a few great resources I'll pass along after this webinar is over. So that's kind of a good intro to our next slide. So there are a number of great resources out there. We've collected just a few of them here. Don't worry about screenshotting this. I'll send this after. And for those of you listening to the recording, we'll also make sure to put some of them in the description on YouTube. But not just resources that come from FACnet, but there's also great information out there from our partners at NFPA and the Institute for Business and Home Safety. And a number of other great resources. So we'll make sure to share those afterwards. And next slide, Michelle. I want to highlight just a few from FACnet that I'll definitely encourage you to check out afterwards. A number of the graphics that you saw today in this presentation, we want to make available for others to use. And so we have an English and a Spanish version of the FAC graphic that you saw earlier in this presentation. We are currently in developing a Spanish version of the Who is Involved FAC graphic that will be that will be uploaded to the website pretty soon. It's not there yet, but look for that in the next couple of weeks. And then maybe most importantly, if you want to hear stories from practitioners like yourself from around the country and be inspired about the amazing work that is happening on the ground, we do have a weekly blog that features voices from around the US that includes practitioners, researchers, FACnet staff, and tries to cover a variety of topics on that FAC wheel. So again, we'll send out some follow-up resources after the webinar is over.
Thanks, Emily. So we just want to give one little note about what the FAC Learning Network is. So the vast majority of this presentation has been about the Fire Adapted Communities Framework. And that is an idea, a concept, a journey. It is a framework that anyone in the world could work on, really. But the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network is a separate concept that we wanted to spend 1 minute on. So when a lot of folks think about networking, they think about passing out business cards or getting connected on LinkedIn or on Nextdoor. And these sort of informal networks are the folks that you're connected to. Those might be your physical neighbors or an affinity group, or they might be your professional connections. And these networks are really important. They're often the pathway for information, support, job prospects. But the center of all of that is really you. These are your contacts, and those kinds of networks are about maintaining your positioning and your orientation with those other partnerships. FACnet, on the other hand, is a formal peer learning network. And so at the center of our network is actually this idea of living with fire. And everyone who's part of the network comes to that work both to meet other people and to gain partnerships, but mostly to work on collectively trying to make progress on that central issue of how to live with fire better. And so we just want to make sure to reiterate that FACnet is not one of these sort of informal, just get to meet people things. It's actually a formalized peer learning network that works to support and provide practitioners with the opportunity to work alongside each other on this issue. But you don't have to be a member of the network to be engaging in fire adaptation, though we certainly do invite folks who are working on that, who are looking for peers and looking for ideas and support to join the network. And the slides that Emily showed already include ways to join. So with that, we want to thank our funders and all of you for joining us today. We learn all of the things we know. We have learned from our own experiences trying to improve wildfire resilience in our communities, and from the amazing folks like yourselves who are out there learning about what living with fire better might mean. And so we just want to really appreciate all of you. And then we have a couple of minutes where we can answer some additional questions in the chat box.